Hello, everyone. I'm just testing my microphone, and I'm 2, 3 more minutes and see if anyone joins. Otherwise, I will start right now. Very well. Okay, so we're going to start now. I'm going to share my screen. I see it. And we are starting with resource management. So, resource management, this is a relatively short webinar on resource management. We're only going to touch a few topics related to it. I'm not an expert on this, but I think that if you want to read more about it, you can just look it up. Like I found a lot of resources while trying to find the content for it. And yeah, let's start. So what is resource management? So I think the name is fairly obvious. Resource management is simply how do you manage your resources. What do you consider resource, or in what are we considering? So it's pretty much it's either planning, scheduling, or allocating resources, right? So this is pretty much what resource management is all about. And what do we call resources? We can be talking about human resources, we can be talking about financial resources, we can be talking about inventory. So it's pretty much everything, every kind of thing that you would need to fulfill a task, like any kind of like tangible or intangible thing that you could need, that you might need to get something done, is a resource. And we're gonna just touch briefly onto how do we manage this. As I said, anything needed to execute a project or a task is pretty much a resource. We're gonna be focusing a bit more here on human resource management, but a lot of these frameworks can be also used for other resources as well, for financial, for inventory resources, for tangible resources and non-tangible as well, for knowledge, for example. Cool. So what are the benefits of resource management? So first, we avoid unforeseen issues. So it helps us. It helps us plan and see before all the issues that happen in the project. Prevent burnout, a good allocation of your resources. Then you might prevent burnout in some people in your team because the work is evenly distributed or fairly distributed throughout the whole project. Why? Because you have your whole resource plan, then it's easier to see how all these things are being used. And at the same time, it also measures efficiency. So when you're working with resources, when you're managing them, or when you're also tracking them, right? So therefore, you're able to see how they are, how these are performing in the tasks that they're supposed to do. So these are the benefits of resource management. What is the basic structure? So we're going to be touching up on mainly 3 points on resource management. The first one is resource allocation. So how do you allocate, how do you put the resources that you have into different tasks or different activities that need to happen in a project? And by the way, I probably forgot to mention that this is a whole resource management by itself, falls under the project management studies, let's say. So it's a part of project management. So everything that I'm going to be saying here, you need to think about in a project framework. So this means whatever project that you want to run in your LC, for example, Empower Austria by itself is also a project, right? So a project is just something that needs to be done by a certain time. So you can think you can think of all these things that I'm going to be saying here in the framework of a project. Then we have resource leveling. So resource leveling is pretty much of all the resources that you have, are you allocating them effectively? Or are they in the right place? Are you bringing them up to the right place as they're supposed to be? So this is about identifying the ones that are performing well versus the ones that are not performing so well. Again, when it comes to people, but also when it comes to other resources. And the last one is resource forecasting. So how make sure to distribute this in the future. So how do you make sure that you're efficiently seeing all the things that you're going to need to develop a project or a task for the future, so during the planning process. So let's start with resource allocation. So resource allocation. The first part for resource allocation is creating a resource plan. So this means that you need to see all need. So simply listing them, right? Like, for example, if you know that you're going to be, we do it all the time with conferences, right? So for example, we know that we're going to be needing a beamer, we know that we're going to be needing a clicker, we know that we're going to be needing flip charts, markers, etc. And then later you need to go a little bit more in detail into estimating how many. So the first thing is kind of like a brainstorming part of the process, and then the second one is, okay, how many will we be needing? And then later you make the schedule. So it sounds super easy, and it is actually, but I think that very often we don't we tend to just simply wing it or not doing it, and we just but these things can actually save us a lot of trouble, and it's also more efficient, and in terms of financials as well. So do you guys remember TACO? So maybe you remember I'm putting here examples of agendas and how do we do this kind of resource schedule. And it's super easy. When if I wanted to use the conference example, a conference is a project for us, right? And we have 3 different types of resources. Right? Well, we might have more, but at least I'm putting here 3 types of resources that we have. We have on the one side needing to deliver. Then we have the knowledge resources, which is the things that we know that we need to downscale. And then we have also the inventory resources, or let's say the things that we're going to be needing for the sessions. And this is, it sounds super simple, and it's something that you might have already seen before, but it's nothing more than a resource plan, right? First, we're putting all the knowledge and all the things that we want to pass on a conference. So it's right here, right? And eventually, we have pretty much the same agenda. I just put a little bit of a zoom in. I didn't include all the days, where we have who are going to be the people facilitating each of the sessions, right? So we know who is where at each time. But that's not enough, because we also know that we need materials at each part of the at each of these sessions. So that's why we also have additionally the same agenda, but with all the resources here, for example, that we're going to be needing, which is like the session needs. And again, it's something that often we tend to do these kind of things without noticing that we're actually doing some resource management, but this is just an example of doing these things. Yeah. So this is not super clear, so that's why I also put this one here. This is a very, very good example of a resource plan. And here it's more obviously towards the human resource. So you can see that on this part is pretty much the people that are in a certain team. And then you have on the right the colors, like you have the days and you have the month and the days, and then you have the colors. So you can always see at all points in the project. Green means the person is not available, and then blue like the person is traveling or has holidays, and yellow means that the person is working on a separate project abroad. So you can see that, and orange as well has a different meaning. So this is pretty much an example of how you can plan out your resources over a period of a month, for example. And here then you would be able to see that on October 6th, most of your resources are not available, right? And this is the whole point. So the whole point is just to simply map out whenever you're on the planning phase of the project, you're simply map out all the list of things that you have available. Then you put how many of them you will need, and then later you start making this schedule. So that's for the first part, for resource management, resource allocation, sorry. And then we go into resource leveling. So as I was saying before, resource leveling is nothing more than this is, I think, a quote from Microsoft, which is the act of taking a project with people assigned to a bunch of tasks and making it so that they don't have to work overtime. So this is pretty much being smart with the things that you have. So if you're talking about in the human resources perspective, we mean here using the right people for the right task, right? So pretty much allocating people to where they're supposed to be. And at the same time, you can apply that for materials, for example, using the best materials for the task that they're meant to be used. So the first and foremost thing that you should understand about resource leveling is you need to understand two things. On the one side, you need to understand the tasks, and on the other side, you need to understand the people. And maybe you, as in charge of a certain area in your EB, let's say that you're LCVP B2B, maybe you don't have control over all the members. Maybe you cannot, if you notice that you see that someone from a different team would be better at selling than in the team where they are. Let's say that you see that someone is much better in finance at selling than someone in your own team. Maybe you don't have control over making those changes, but you do have control over your own team, and you have different tasks on your own team. Even when we go by products, we have different stages of the customer flow, and sometimes the task needed by each stage of the customer flow requires a different profile and a different type of person, right? So if you know that here the task at hand is selling, and you know that you have people that are really good sellers and you're putting them there, but if you know that the task at hand is approving, or if it's value delivery, which is being in touch with people, servicing people, being reliable, then maybe, and if you have the profile of a seller who is very good at talking to people but not necessarily at servicing, then maybe you should not put that person, or you should not give that person a big responsibility for value delivery or for consideration. So this is the idea behind it. Under tasks, what we have is simply a list of actions that need to happen during the project. So if you want to understand your task, simply it's nothing more than the list of actions that it needs to happen. Then later you need to understand also what are the skills needed for the action to be performed. So like on the one side, you have the actions that need to be performed, but then later you also have what does it take in order to perform that action. And then later you're clustering those actions to allow for specialization. So what do I mean by this? I mean, like, maybe this is nothing more than making a JD for a person, right? So you're starting to cluster all the tasks. And for example, you see if you're working on a project like Global Village, let's say, and you see that one task is to contact companies to tell them about Global Village, and the other task is to explain Global Village to students at university, and another task would be to organize a schedule for the cooking teams, let's say. So now you see that the first two tasks can actually be assigned in the same cluster because they're more like selling related tasks or more about explaining the event. So you can see that they can go up to a certain profile of a person, right? Whereas the other one about making a schedule, maybe that requires a bit of a more structured personality. So that can go into a different into a different person. So these are the kind of things that you should know when you're leveling resources. And then other people, I have 4 things here. First is give clear KPIs to your people. So have your people clear in their minds what are how do they know if they're performing or not. Why is this important for leveling? Because how can you know if someone is good or bad if they're not even being tracked on the KPIs, on clear KPIs, right? Like how is someone supposed to know that their goal is to get 45 signups if that's not one of their KPIs? So you need to understand, and they need to understand what are the KPIs that they're working with so that they can be assessed properly. Then later, you need to track people by individual results. This is something that, again, sounds super logical, but we rarely do in ISEC as well, and we should do. Just simply, you need to have an individual, you need to have, understand what is the individual contribution of every person in your team. Then number 3 is on one-on-ones, check their affinity for their tasks at hand. So you know that you need to have one-on-ones with your team. You need to know that you need to have a personal development conversations with your team. So this is when you can check what are the tasks that they're struggling with, what are the tasks that they love doing, what are the tasks that they're good at doing, what are the tasks that they're not good at doing, and this can help you during the leveling process. And you're going to need to plug and play here a lot because you're going to see that the tasks in your project are going to change over time. As I mentioned before with our products, when we move in the stages of customer flow, at some point there is no more approving to do, for example, and maybe approving switches to value delivery, but maybe those are 2 different profiles. Maybe some person, and at some point, for example, now in January, we're going to be having sales and value delivery at the same time. So we're going to be having EPs here that need to be serviced, but we're also going to need to be doing sales. And this is up to you to see how you organize your people to put them in the position where they fit the best, while at the same time you're fulfilling all the necessary things that need to be done. So that's also an important thing to mention. Another one is to review their JD at least every quarter. And in the sense of like, that doesn't mean that you need to change it. It means that you need to review it with them to see which part of their, how are they performing with each part of their JD. So that's important so that you can have a good leveling assessment of them. And more important is performance management. So leveling doesn't work if you don't do performance management. And luckily, we already have a whole TM process in ISEC that is about performance management. So you can simply check it out. So I don't want to get into detail, very much in detail with that, because this is not the purpose of this webinar. But I think that if you're doing performance management well, then you're doing the people part of the resource leveling very well as well, because you're simply understanding how your people are working, and therefore you can put them in the right place according to that understanding. That doesn't mean, however, if you're doing performance management very well, that doesn't mean that you're doing the task, that you're understanding the task very well, because performance management is very much about how your people are performing, but that's why it's super important for you to also understand the task. So just to go back to this slide, understanding the task and understanding the people is what leads to a very, very good resource leveling process. Yes, and then we have resource forecasting, which is a bit. Here I will be really super brief, which is you need to understand 4 things in order to make a good forecasting of your resources. So what does it mean, forecasting? It just simply means how do you know in the future with what can you count, or with what can you not count in the future about your resources. So the first thing that you need to is the scope of the project. So is it a big project? Is it a small project? Is it a project that is going to be lasting 1 year or 2 years? So this is something that should help you understand what is your maneuvering in terms of resources. If it's a really big project, then maybe you know that at certain that the amount of resources that you might need if something goes wrong is much higher than with a small project, right? So you need to therefore plan a little bit more. Then you also need to understand the possible constraints. So sometimes you have a very good idea for a project and you have everything out, but then you realize that you have certain constraints. And constraints can be all kinds of things, right? It can be that, for example, university tells you, of course, you can run this project, but in order for you to run it, you're gonna need to you can only use these 2 classrooms, or you can only or you need to mention at all times that this is under the framework of this much bigger project of the university. So you know that you have certain constraints that that the project can only stay within them. The typical one is the financial constraint. Obviously, like you have a budget that you need to work with, and you cannot go over it. But here is important, and that's why I didn't want to mention financial at the beginning, because there's so many other things that go under constraints in a project that are not financial. So you have maybe also your team constraints. So like maybe you have a team of 6 and you know that you will not get more than 6. You know that no matter what happens, no one will be able to help you other than these 6 people, and therefore your constraint is already HR constraint. Then another thing that you need to keep in mind is the unforeseen cost. So what are the possible things that can cost money in the future while running this project? And additionally, we also have potential risks. So what are the risks that you need to analyze the risk of running the project? And for this, luckily as well in ISEC, we have a risk assessment framework that you can use, or that you can that you will be seeing during your monthly or quarterly reviews on how to assess the risk in a project or in your area. So what do we have in ISEC in each of these parts? So you guys remember that it's 3 parts to consider in terms of resource management. The first one is resource allocation. And what do we have for resource allocation in ISEC? We already have a set of JDs. We have already templates for agenda creation, and we already have planning tool. So you don't need to worry so much about resource allocation. The only thing that you need to do is simply knowing the set resources that you have, because for example you will have recruitment soon, and when you have it, you're gonna know your final amount of people, and then you see you already have your JDs, which is the tasks, right? So what you need to do is simply pretty much complementing the people with the tasks, and that's going to be your resource allocation. Then we have resource leveling. Here we have performance management as a TM process. So everything that you need to know about how to evaluate your people is on the TM process, performance management. And then lastly, we have for resource forecasting, we have the risk assessment tool that you can use in order for you to like structure yourself and see what you might need in the future. And thank you. That is pretty much everything. So ask questions for this. I would just like you to tell me what are the things that you need to keep in mind for whenever you're doing the resource allocation. So I mentioned 3 things at the beginning, and yeah, that's pretty much everything. Thank you very much for listening, and have a good day.